Moving on to the next important topic that you're going to run into quite often when working with Windows Phone apps or really any mobile app has to do with being able to store data locally on that device. And I'm just talking about accessing the device's file system and maybe creating a file to maybe save the state of your application, or maybe saving some of the form entry data that the customer has filled in so far, and then maybe they navigate away from a page and then ultimately retrieving that back and pre-populating that form with that data already so they don't have to enter it all in again, because as you and I both know, that can become a very tedious operation for any end user. So in this lesson, I'd like to show you the basic simplest concept, the simplest way for you to be able to access the file system on a Windows Phone 8 device and be able to read and write data to that file system. So as you can see here, I kind of have a pre-built screen laid out here for you. So this is my main page.xaml file. It's fairly simple. It's got four main UI elements. Here we have a text box at the top where we can enter in some text, and then we have a write button here that ultimately is going to allow us to write to the file system. So we're going to write the code behind the scenes in the code behind file to actually handle that. Then below that, and you can't really see it right now, is a text block that's going to show the retrieved data that we're getting from the local storage. And then we have a read button underneath that that's going to allow us to ultimately read. But before we can actually read, we have to write. So initially this read button is actually disabled by setting the is enabled property to false. So it's a very simple UI, not a whole lot going on here, but it's going to allow me to show you how to access the file system. So if I were to go ahead and take a look at the code behind files, right now I have two event handlers. I have the button right click event and the button read click event. And those are merely set by using the button click property on the button right button, as well as the click property here on the button read button. So now once I'm in here, I'm going to be able to start to read and write data. Now if you did any sort of work with Windows 7, you were probably getting familiar with the isolated storage concept. While that still exists in one form or another in Windows 8 and 8.1, you're going to want to start getting away from that, because Microsoft has been spending a lot of time and energy starting to merge these concepts of the phone and the Windows proper file access strategies to become more aligned with each other. It's starting to tell the whole WinRT picture and allowing you to use those type of storage APIs, namely storage folders and storage files, on both platforms. So let's go ahead and see what we would do now. So when you're working with storage within Windows Phone, you typically have two broad categories. You have your app data, which is typically going to be all of your installation paths and things like that are typically only going to be read-only for you from your application. So you're more than likely not going to spend a lot of time in there. Where you are going to spend most of your time is what used to be referred to in Windows 7 as isolated storage, and now is considered local storage or local files or local folders. They're kind of going to this whole local concept. Also, another thing that you're going to have to start getting used to if you haven't been acclimated to this yet either is the whole concept of async and await. This is a new strategy that's been coming around for a little while from Microsoft in the .NET and C# worlds that allow you to write asynchronous code extremely simply just by using a little bit of syntactical sugar within your code, within your C# or VB.NET, that is ultimately going to allow you to write this asynchronous code, and all of the WinRT methods that have been deemed possible to run longer than some arbitrary number, 70 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds or something like that, have ultimately been converted to async and await style methods. So if you're not familiar with working with those, don't worry about it. We're going to go over it now, but you're going to start to get quite used to it very quickly, as it's used in very many places in both the Windows Phone platform as well as the Windows platform for Windows 8 and beyond. So having said that, let's go ahead and start to write this. So what I'm ultimately going to want to do is I'm going to want to actually do some sort of code here. So I'm going to just put a little comment here that I'm going to call a write method. So I'm going to call a write method here. And ultimately, after I call my write method, I'm going to want to make my write button enabled equal to false so that that button no longer works. And then I want to set my read button is enabled to true so that I can kind of go back and forth. And then ultimately I want to do the same thing below, but in this case this is going to be flip-flopped where my write button is going to be enabled and my read button is going to be disabled. So now that we have that, let's just go ahead and run this real quick just to make sure that everything is kind of looking the way we would expect and running the way we want. So once we get to this point, we're going to write, and once that's done, we're going to come over and read, and then we're going to come over and write, and we're going to go back and forth like that. So now what we want to do is we actually want to write this code in here that's going to handle the read and write methods. So since this is going to ultimately need us to write code in a asynchronous manner, we're going to extract this out into two separate little helper methods. So we're going to have a private, and we're going to use our async keyword. And because this is technically not returning anything, you would typically want to say void, but when you're using the async await keywords, you're actually going to have to return a task, which is just going to allow you to specify whether or not something is actually completed. And we'll just call this write to file. And you can make this as fancy as you want, maybe passing in a file name or something like that. I'm just going to hard code this example just so you can kind of see how the basic flow is going to work. Now there's a number of different ways that you can ultimately save this data and what format you want to save it, but I like to keep things relatively simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the data that is in my text box and I'm going to ultimately get the file bytes from it. So I'm going to transform it into bytes and then ultimately save those bytes to the local file system. So I'm going to use the encoding dot, we'll just say UTF-8, and we'll go ahead and get the bytes for what we actually have in our text block entry.text, and we're going to convert that to a character array. So now what's going to happen is we're going to get the data that's actually in that text box or that text box and save it into file bytes. So now we have that data. Now we can go ahead and save it, but there's a couple different things we have to do to get there. So I want to show you how to actually create a folder as well as a file on this. So we're just going to create an arbitrary folder here. We'll call it local, and we'll set that equal to, and this is where the Windows Phone 8 side of the world starts to take over. So we're actually going to go into Windows, and we're going to look at storage, and we're going to look at application data, and then ultimately we want current, which is going to give us the current application data. And there's a lot of different options here, but we want the local folder. So once we have that local folder, now we can start to mess around with that location within the file system. And actually I'm going to change my variable name. We'll call this local folder just so it makes a little bit more sense. So let's go ahead and create a new folder there. So we're going to call this the data folder, and we'll set that equal to, and in this case we're going to want to use that local folder, and we're going to want to call the create folder method. But as you can see here, when we start to create a folder, this is going to be an asynchronous operation. So we're going to create a folder here, and we are going to give it a desired name. So we'll call this our data folder. And then ultimately we can optionally choose to create a collision option, which just is kind of a way to say if something isn't there, go ahead and create it, or if it's already there, just open it, and those types of things. So in this case, we're going to open it if it exists. Now there's a problem here because this method here is actually returning a task or an asynchronous operation. So in order for us to actually get the result of this create folder, we're going to have to await this operation. So now that we've awaited this operation, we're actually going to get back a reference to that particular storage folder. So now that we have that storage folder, we can start to create files within it. So we've actually created it. Now we're going to put something in it. So now we're going to create a new file. So we'll say var file is equal to, we're going to do a similar type of operation where we're going to have to await. And in this case, we have our data folder, and I want to create a file. So I'm going to create a file asynchronously. And in this case, we'll just call it very simply datafile.txt. Now you can give it any sort of name, any sort of extension that you would like. And we have a similar option here where we can create collision options, and we're actually going to replace existing. So each time we do this, we're going to overwrite whatever exists there, if anything exists there. So now we have access to this file that's in a particular folder. So we're going to grab the data file.txt, and we're going to do that in our data folder. So now once we have that, we can then go ahead and start to actually write our data there. So we're going to use our using block, and we're going to say var s is going to be equal to, and we're going to once again await, and we're going to go into file, and we're going to say open stream for write async. And the reason we're using our using statement here, no pun intended, is because our open stream is going to return a stream which implements the iDisposable interface, and this is just good practice to always wrap those types of things in a using block. And then once we get in here, we're going to say s.write, and we're going to write our file bytes starting at offset 0, and we're going to write file bytes.length. So it's going to write all of that data that we pulled from our text box entry and ultimately write it to the file system. So now that we actually have this write to file method, we need to actually call it. So what we're going to want to do, instead of doing this little comment here, we're going to want to call write to file. But we've done two things here that are slight no-nos. So what we're going to want to do here, because this is an asynchronous method, we're going to want to actually append on the end of this the async word, just to make this more clear that this is an asynchronous method, because we're using the async and await keywords. And because we're doing that, we're going to have to call that write to file async method. But because this is an asynchronous method, we need to decorate it with the await keyword, and because we're doing that, we have to insert the async keyword into our method signature. Now I know that's a lot to keep track of, but just remember that every time you want to use the await keyword to actually do some asynchronous work, you have to use the async keyword within the method signature. So now when we click on our write button, we should be able to write to the file system, and now ultimately we want to do the reverse of all of that and be able to read from that. So we're going to do a very similar operation here, where I'm going to create another private method, and this is once again going to be asynchronous, returning a task, and this is going to be called read file. Now within here we're going to do something very similar. We're going to grab our local folder, so we have to go back in and get those same things that we did before. So we'll say windows.storage.application-data.current.local folder. So now I can go and check to see if I actually have that, because I don't want to be doing any of these operations if that doesn't exist, so if it's not equal to null. So once I have that, then we'll go ahead and get our data folder again. So our data folder is going to be equal to, and we're going to await our local folder .get folder async this time. So we want to get that folder we created, which was called data folder. And once we have our data folder, we're going to go ahead and grab our file. So we're going to say var file is going to be equal to await, and we want to go into our data folder, and we want to open stream for read async this time, and we're going to go ahead and grab the data file.txt. So now we have that capability of being able to read there. And now this time we're going to use a slightly different mechanism to read, just to show you that there's multiple ways of doing this. So once again, we're going to have to use a using block. So we'll say var, this time we're going to use a stream reader. So we'll say stream reader is equal to a new instance of stream reader, and we're going to pass into it a stream, which is going to be our file. So once we have that stream reader, we can go ahead and read out of that. And this time when we're done, we're going to actually say that the text block .text is going to be set to our stream reader .read to end. So there you go. So now we have our little helper method that's going to read our file. And in this case, we're going to call our method here. Remember, where this is going to be an asynchronous, so we'll say read file async. So we're going to have to change our name here again. So we'll call this async. And then ultimately, because we're using our await keyword, we have to decorate our method signature with async. So there we go. That should be the basics of being able to write to the file system, creating a folder and creating a file, and then writing to it, and then going into that particular folder, grabbing an instance or grabbing that particular file, and then reading from it and putting it onto the UI. So now we'll go ahead and run our application using F5, and now we're going to get something here. So now we're going to enter in some text this time, and this time we're going to say something like hello file storage. And once we've done that, we'll go ahead and hit write. So now we believe that if everything has gone right, that that particular data has been stored locally within our local folder. And if I were to come down and hit our read button, then I would expect to see it pop up here. And as you can see here, it's slightly smaller text. It's kind of difficult to see. So just to prove that it is there so you can see that a little bit better, I will come in here to our text block and I'll merely change our font size to be something a little bit bigger, say 25. So we'll go ahead and write this again, or run our application again, and this time we'll do the same thing. We'll say hello file system, like that. We will write to the file and then we will go ahead and read, and there you go. You can see now hello file system. So that is the very basic way for you to be able to access the local storage within your device to be able to store very simple data structures. Now you don't want to spend a lot of time storing a lot of very heavy objects. That's going to require you to take up a lot of space and have these operations ultimately take a while. So I would keep these types of operations to be relatively simple, but you can definitely use them very flexibly when trying to save data that you want to store on the file system for your end user, ultimately for many different purposes.